Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight's story is about Aristotle, a boy from a small town on the edge of the Greek world who spent his whole life trying to understand everything, and who, in the end, understood quite a lot. In the year 322 BCE, on the island of Euboea, in a small town called Chalcis, an old man lay in a modest house across the narrow strait of water from the mainland of Greece. He was 62 years old, and his body, which had carried him across so much of the known world, was finally giving out. Outside, the Euripus Strait moved in its strange and famous way, the current shifting direction several times a day, a puzzle that sailors and philosophers alike had wondered about for generations. Some say that in his final days this man looked out at that restless water and thought about all the things in nature he had never fully explained. It is a lovely story. We cannot know if it is true. What we do know is this. The man's name was Aristotle, and he had spent his life trying to understand everything. Not everything in a vague, hopeful way, the way a curious child might wonder about the world, but everything in a systematic, patient, exhaustive way. He wanted to know why the heart beats and why a rock falls and why a tragedy on stage moves us to pity and fear and why the stars keep their courses. He wanted to know what makes a good life good, what makes a good government just, what makes a good argument valid. He wanted to know it all, and remarkably he came closer than almost anyone before or since. He had been born far from Chalcis, in a small town called Stagira, on the northern edge of the Greek world, the son of a court physician. He had been a student in Athens for 20 years under a man named Plato, who himself had studied under a man named Socrates, so that in Aristotle we find the third link of perhaps the most important chain of teachers and students in the history of Western thought. He had tutored a boy who would grow up to conquer most of the known world. He had founded his own school in Athens, a place called the Lyceum, where he would walk with his students along covered walkways as they talked, which is perhaps why later generations called his followers the Peripatetics, from the Greek word for walking about. And now, at the end, he was not in Athens. He was in Chalcis, a guest in a house that had belonged to his mother's family, because Athens was no longer safe for him. The city that loved wisdom, or claimed to, had grown suspicious of philosophers before. It had put Socrates to death for his questions 3/4 of a century earlier. And now, with the death of Aristotle's former student Alexander the Great, and the sudden collapse of Macedonian power that had protected Aristotle for so long, Athens turned its old suspicion toward him too. He were accused of impiety, the same charge that had killed Socrates. Rather than wait for the outcome, rather than, in his own words, allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy, he left the city and crossed the water to Chalcis. There, in that house by the strait, his life came to its end. The sources that have survived across more than 2,000 years do not give us a dramatic death scene. No famous last words carved into memory the way Socrates' last words were carved into memory by his student Plato. What we have instead are the quieter facts. Aristotle wrote a will, which survives to us, in which he made careful provision for his family, for his slaves, some of whom he freed, and for the completion of certain statues he had commissioned. He asked to be buried beside his first wife Pythias, according to her own wishes, which tells us something tender about a man history often remembers as cold and analytical. He thought of practical matters, of people who depended on him, even as his own body failed. And then, in that year of 322 BCE, the mind that had mapped so much of human knowledge went still. But to understand how a boy from a small town in the north of Greece became the man whose ideas would shape medicine, biology, logic, ethics, politics, and literary theory for more than 2,000 years, whose works would be studied in Christian monasteries and Islamic universities and Renaissance academies alike, we must go back. We must go back nearly 80 years before that death in Chalcis, to a different town, a different family, and the birth of a child who was given a name that meant, roughly, the best purpose, or the best end. It is a fitting name, as it turns out, for a boy who would spend his whole life asking what the best end, the best purpose of everything might be. Before we go there, a small word. If you're listening to this to help yourself drift off to sleep, that is exactly what this is for. There is no need to remember every name or every date. Let the voice carry you. Let the story become a kind of gentle current, like the strait outside that old man's window, moving back and forth, in and out, until your own thoughts grow quiet. If this kind of long, careful story helps you rest, you might consider following along for future ones, so that you always have a new voice waiting for you at the end of the day. But for now, let us return to the beginning. To understand the world Aristotle was born into, we should first understand the world of Greece in the 4th century before our era. It was not one country, but a scattering of independent city-states, polis, each with its own government, its own laws, its own gods and festivals, though bound together loosely by a shared language and a shared sense of what it meant to be Greek, as opposed to what the Greeks called barbarian, meaning simply those who did not speak Greek. Athens was the largest and most culturally important of these cities, a place that had, within living memory, produced the playwrights Sophocles and Euripides, the historian Thucydides, and the philosopher Socrates. Sparta, its old rival, had a very different character, built entirely around military discipline. Beyond these famous cities lay dozens of smaller ones, scattered across the Greek mainland, the islands of the Aegean Sea, and the coast of what is now Turkey. To the north of this Greek heartland lay Macedon, a kingdom that the southern Greeks tended to view as half barbarian, rough and unrefined, ruled by kings rather than the assemblies and councils that governed Athens. And on the edge of Macedon, on a small peninsula called Chalcidice that reached out into the northern Aegean Sea, sat the town of Stagira. It was not a grand place. It was a modest trading town, founded generations earlier by settlers from another Greek city, and it survived on fishing and trade and whatever agriculture the rocky land could support. It was here, in the year 384 BCE, that Aristotle was born. We should pause on that number for a moment, not because dates matter for their own sake, but because it helps to place him in time. This was 15 years after the death of Socrates in Athens. Plato, who had become Aristotle's teacher, was already a grown man of about 43, running his famous school, the Academy, for a decade already. The Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens had been standing for about 60 years, still gleaming with paint and gold that has long since worn away. It was a world still very much shaped by the previous century's wars, particularly the long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War, which had ended only 17 years before Aristotle's birth, leaving Athens diminished but still the intellectual centre of the Greek world. Aristotle's father was a man named Nicomachus, and this detail matters more than it might first appear, because Nicomachus was a physician, specifically the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon, grandfather of the boy who would one day be called Alexander the Great. This connection between the family of Aristotle and the royal house of Macedon would prove to be one of the defining threads running through his entire life, though as a small child in Stagira, He could not have known where it would eventually lead him, to the tutoring of a young prince and to friendships and enmities that would follow him for the rest of his days. We know very little about Aristotle's mother, whose name was Phaestis. What we do know suggests that she came from a family with roots on the island of Euboea, in a town called Chalcis, the very town where Aristotle would, so many decades later, spend his final days. There is something quietly moving in this fact, something that the ancient sources do not comment on directly, but that later readers have often noticed. A man who travelled across so much of the Greek world, who tutored kings and founded schools and mapped the natural world with his own hands, ended his life in the town of his mother's family, as though something in him returned, in the end, to where his story had quietly begun on his mother's side, even if his birth had taken place in his father's town of Stagira. Being the son of a court physician meant that Aristotle grew up with certain advantages that most boys in Stagira would not have had. Medicine in ancient Greece was, at its best, a discipline that valued careful observation, the study of the body, the tracking of symptoms over time, and a certain skepticism towards supernatural explanations of illness in favour of natural causes. This tradition traced back to Hippocrates, the physician whose name is still attached to the ethical oath doctors take today, and whose school of medicine emphasized close observation of patients over reliance on ritual or superstition. It is often suggested by those who study Aristotle's life that his father's profession planted an early seed in him, a habit of looking closely at living things, at bodies, at the small mechanical details of how creatures work, that would blossom decades later into some of the most careful biological writings the ancient world ever produced. We cannot know this for certain. Childhood influences rarely leave direct documentary evidence, but when we later find the adult Aristotle dissecting animals, cataloguing hundreds of species, and writing with the eye of someone who has actually looked closely at a chicken embryo or the gills of a fish, it is hard not to wonder whether some of that habit of careful looking began at his father's side. Tragedy came early to Aristotle's life, in a pattern that was, sadly, not unusual for the ancient world, where childhood mortality and early parental death were common even among the privileged. Both of his parents died while he was still young, likely before he reached his teenage years, though the exact ages are not recorded with certainty in the surviving sources. This left Aristotle in the care of a guardian, a man named Proxenus of Athens, who may have been married to Aristotle's older sister Arymneste. Proxenus appears to have taken his responsibilities seriously. He saw to it that the boy received a proper education, and later in life, Aristotle would repay this early kindness by helping to raise Proxenus's own son, Nicanor, treating him as something between a ward and an adopted son, and eventually arranging a marriage between Nicanor and Aristotle's own daughter. It is a small thread of loyalty running through a life that could, in other respects, seem austere and cerebral. The boy who lost his parents young grew into a man who remembered debts of care and repaid them. We do not know precisely what Aristotle's earliest years of education looked like, whether he had private tutors in Stagira, as a family of his father's standing could likely afford, or whether his guardian arranged for something more formal. What we do know is that by the time he was 17 years old, in the year 367 BCE, a decision was made that would change the entire course of his life. He was sent to Athens to study at the school of the most famous philosopher in the Greek world, a man named Plato. Consider for a moment what this journey must have meant for a 17-year-old boy from a small northern town. Athens in 367 BCE was, by the standards of the ancient world, a great metropolis, filled with temples and marketplaces and theatres, humming with political debate in its assembly, crowded with merchants and sailors from across the Mediterranean, bringing goods and news from Egypt, from Persia, from the Greek colonies scattered as far as Sicily and the Black Sea. For a boy from Stagira, this must have felt like arriving at the centre of the world, and in a sense, for the world of ideas, it was. The school that Aristotle joined was called the Academy, named for the grove of trees, sacred to a legendary hero named Academus, in which it was located just outside the walls of Athens. Plato had founded it roughly 2 decades earlier, and it had become the gathering place for the finest minds of the Greek world who wished to study philosophy, mathematics, and the nature of reality itself. It was not a school in the way we might imagine a modern university, with buildings and formal degrees. It was closer to a community of scholars who lived, argued, ate, and thought together, gathering to hear Plato lecture, to debate among themselves, and to work through problems in logic, geometry, ethics, and metaphysics. Plato himself was, by this time, a man in his 60s, already famous throughout the Greek world for his written dialogues, most of them featuring his own teacher, Socrates, as the central figure engaging in conversation and debate with various Athenians. Through these dialogues, Plato had developed and expressed his own philosophy, most famously the idea that the physical world we perceive with our senses is only a shadow or imitation of a deeper, unchanging world of perfect forms, and that true knowledge comes not from observing the physical world, but from reasoning toward these eternal forms. It was, in many ways, a philosophy that looked away from the messy, changing world of particular things and toward an abstract realm of perfect ideas. Aristotle would spend 20 years at the Academy, arriving as a teenager and remaining until he was 37 years old. 20 years is a remarkable span of time to spend in one intellectual community, nearly the entire span of what we might call a young adulthood, and it tells us something important. Whatever tensions would later emerge between Aristotle's own thinking and Plato's, and there would be significant ones, this was not a brief or superficial education. Aristotle was shaped, deeply and thoroughly, by the Academy and by Plato himself. The ancient sources, written by later biographers who were not present but who drew on earlier accounts now lost to us, describe Aristotle as an unusually dedicated and gifted student. One later writer, a biographer named Diogenes Laertius, records that Plato referred to Aristotle's house as the house of the reader, suggesting that Aristotle was known even among his fellow students for his voracious appetite for books and written texts, which was somewhat unusual in a culture that still placed enormous value on spoken debate and memorized recitation over private reading. This detail, small as it is, hints at something essential about Aristotle's mind. Where his fellow students absorbed knowledge through conversation and argument, Aristotle seems to have supplemented this with an almost obsessive commitment to written sources, to collecting and organizing information in a way that would later allow him to produce systematic treatises covering nearly every field of human knowledge then known. There is also a story, though we should treat it with the appropriate caution given to ancient anecdotes, that Plato once called Aristotle the mind of the school, or in some versions the intelligence of the school, suggesting that even as a young man, Aristotle was recognized as possessing an unusually powerful and rigorous intellect. Whether or not the exact words are accurate, the general shape of the story, that Aristotle was seen as exceptional even among a community of exceptional thinkers, seems consistent with everything else we know about how his career unfolded. But we should not imagine that Aristotle's relationship with Plato and the Academy was one of simple, uncomplicated admiration. Even in these early years, seeds of disagreement were being planted, seeds that would eventually grow into two of the most influential and distinct philosophical traditions in Western history. Where Plato taught that true reality lay in abstract, unchanging forms that existed apart from the physical world, the young Aristotle seems to have been drawn, again and again, back toward the physical world itself, toward the particular details of plants and animals and human societies as they actually existed, not as shadows of some perfect ideal, but as things worth understanding in their own right, on their own terms. This difference in temperament and philosophy would only deepen over the years, but during Plato's lifetime, Aristotle remained within the academy, contributing to its work, and by most accounts, treated as one of its most valued members. It is worth remembering that these 20 years were not spent in some serene, uninterrupted bubble of philosophical contemplation. Athens itself, during this period, went through political turbulence, wars, and the ordinary business of a city-state managing its relationships with its neighbours and rivals. And Aristotle, though a resident of Athens for 2 decades, was never actually a citizen of the city. He was what the Greeks called a metic, a resident foreigner, permitted to live and work in Athens but never granted the full legal rights and protections of citizenship, unable to own land within the city's territory, always somewhat an outsider even in the place that had become the centre of his intellectual life. This status as a perpetual outsider, present but never fully belonging, is a thread that would follow Aristotle throughout his life, and it may help explain both his eventual departure from Athens at the very end of his life and, perhaps, something in his careful, patient temperament, the temperament of a man who observes closely because he is always, in some sense, watching from just outside. During these academy years, Aristotle also experienced loss again. It is likely that his sister, Arymneste, who had helped raise him after their parents' deaths, died at some point during this period, though the exact timing is uncertain in our sources. What is clearer is that Aristotle maintained close bonds with his extended family throughout his life, bonds that would matter enormously later when he took in his sister's grandson, a young man named Callisthenes, and helped establish him as a historian who would eventually accompany Alexander the Great on his famous campaigns into Asia, a decision that would end in tragedy, as we will see later in this story. It may help here to slow down and actually look at the specific nature of the disagreement that was quietly forming between the young Aristotle and his aging teacher, because it represents one of the most consequential philosophical divergences in the entire history of Western thought, and understanding it helps explain almost everything that would follow in Aristotle's later, independent work. Plato had argued, most famously through the mouth of Socrates in dialogues such as the Republic, that the physical objects we encounter through our senses, a particular tree, a particular horse, a particular act of justice performed by a particular person, are all imperfect, changeable copies of eternal, unchanging, perfect forms that exist in a realm entirely separate from the physical world. On this view, true knowledge could never come from studying the particular trees or horses, or just actions we encounter in ordinary life, since these are always imperfect and always changing, but only from turning the mind away from the senses entirely and reasoning toward the unchanging forms themselves, using mathematics and dialectical argument as the primary tools of this ascent toward true understanding. Aristotle came to believe this picture had things almost exactly backward. Rather than treating the physical world as a lesser imperfect shadow of some separate realm of perfect forms, Aristotle argued that the essential nature, or form, of a thing exists within the particular object itself, not floating in some separate metaphysical realm apart from it. The form of a horse, in Aristotle's view, is not some perfect otherworldly horse existing apart from all actual horses, but rather the specific pattern of organization, the specific set of characteristics and capacities that makes any particular horse the kind of thing it is, embedded directly within that horse's own material body. This might sound like a fairly technical, abstract disagreement, and in one sense it certainly is, but its practical consequences were enormous. It meant that for Aristotle, unlike for Plato, the careful, patient study of actual particular things in the physical world, the very kind of work he would go on to do with such dedication on the island of Lesbos, watching chicken embryos develop and cataloguing hundreds of species of fish, was not a distraction from true philosophical knowledge, but was itself the very path toward genuine understanding. Where Plato's philosophy tended to draw the mind's attention away from the changing physical world and toward eternal abstractions, Aristotle's philosophy turned attention back toward that physical world, insisting that careful observation of actual particular things was not beneath the dignity of the philosopher, but was in fact the necessary foundation for any genuine wisdom about how the world actually works. This fundamental difference in temperament and method has echoed down through the centuries in ways that go well beyond the technical details of ancient metaphysics. It is sometimes said, with only a little exaggeration, that the entire subsequent history of Western philosophy can be broadly divided between those thinkers who lean more toward Plato's emphasis on abstract reasoning and ideal forms existing somewhat apart from ordinary sensory experience, and those who lean more toward Aristotle's emphasis on careful empirical observation of the actual physical world as the foundation for genuine knowledge. This divide would later be given vivid visual expression by the Renaissance painter Raphael in his famous fresco, The School of Athens, painted for the Vatican more than 1800 years after Aristotle's death, in which Plato is depicted pointing upward toward the heavens, gesturing toward his realm of abstract eternal forms, while beside him Aristotle gestures outward and downward with his open hand, toward the earth, toward the physical world of concrete, particular things. It is a striking image, and though it simplifies an enormously complex philosophical relationship into a single visual gesture, it captures something genuinely true about the difference in temperament between teacher and student, a difference that had already been quietly taking shape during those 20 years Aristotle spent within the walls of the academy, listening to his teacher, absorbing his teacher's arguments, and slowly, respectfully, beginning to construct an alternative vision of what philosophy itself should be. Then, in the year 347 BCE, Plato died. He was around 80 years old, having led the academy for 4 decades, and with his death came a moment of decision for Aristotle, then a man of 37, who had spent more than half his life in that school. Leadership of the academy passed not to Aristotle, despite his evident brilliance and long dedication, but to Plato's nephew, a man named Speusippus. We do not know exactly what Aristotle felt about being passed over, whether he even sought the position, though later biographers have often speculated that his philosophical disagreements with the direction Speusippus and the academy were taking, moving further into a kind of mathematical mysticism that Aristotle found unconvincing, played some role in what happened next. What happened next was departure. Aristotle left Athens. When Aristotle left Athens after Plato's death, he did not go alone. He travelled with a fellow academy member named Xenocrates, and together they journeyed to Assos, a city on the northwestern coast of Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. This region was ruled at the time by a man named Hermias, who had once been a fellow student at the academy himself and had gone on to become the ruler of a small but significant territory. Hermias welcomed his old classmate warmly, and Aristotle would spend roughly 3 years in Assos, a period that scholars sometimes describe as the beginning of his own independent philosophical school, a small community of thinkers gathering around him much as students had once gathered around Plato. It was here too that Aristotle's personal life took an important turn. He married a woman named Pythias, who was, by most accounts, either the niece or adopted daughter of Hermias himself. This marriage connected Aristotle even more closely to the ruling family of the region, and by all indications from the surviving sources, it was a genuinely affectionate union, not merely a political arrangement. Pythias would bear Aristotle a daughter, whom they also named Pythias, and the couple appears to have shared a warm and settled domestic life, quite unlike the wandering intellectual existence that might otherwise define this period. The relationship between Aristotle and Hermias came to a devastating end, however, when the Persian Empire, which controlled much of Asia Minor and viewed Hermias's small independent territory with suspicion, moved against him. Hermias was captured through treachery, tortured for information about his alliance with Macedon, and eventually executed. Ancient sources report that Aristotle, upon learning of his friend's terrible death, composed a poem in his honour, a hymn to virtue that has survived in fragments, praising Hermias's courage and steadfastness. It is one of the few moments in the surviving record where we glimpse something like raw grief in Aristotle, a man whose written works are otherwise so careful, so measured, so committed to systematic analysis rather than personal emotion. The loss of Hermias, and the political dangers that had caused it, likely prompted Aristotle to move on from the region, and he relocated to the nearby island of Lesbos, along with a former student named Theophrastus, who was himself a native of the island. It was on Lesbos, in the years around 345 to 343 BCE, that Aristotle undertook some of the most remarkable scientific work of his entire life, work that would remain unmatched in its scope and detail for well over 1,000 years afterward. Lesbos has a large sheltered lagoon called the Pira, filled with an enormous variety of marine life, and Aristotle, together with Theophrastus, spent this period in close, patient observation of the natural world around them. They dissected animals. They observed the development of chicken embryos day by day, opening eggs at different stages to watch the formation of the heart and blood vessels, some of the earliest embryological research on record anywhere in the world. They catalogued fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and countless other creatures, recording their anatomy, their reproductive habits, their behaviours. Consider the sheer patience this work required. There were no microscopes. There was no established scientific method as we would recognise it today, no journals to consult, no prior body of systematic biological literature to build upon in any serious way. Aristotle was, in large part, inventing the discipline of biology as he went, relying on nothing but careful observation, dissection, comparison across species, and rigorous logical categorization. He would go on to describe or classify roughly 500 different species of animals across his biological writings, an achievement that stood as one of the foundational texts of natural science for close to 2,000 years, still being consulted and admired by naturalists well into the era of the European Renaissance. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what this tells us about the man himself, the temperament and habits that made such work possible. This was not the labour of someone seeking quick answers or dramatic conclusions. It was the labour of someone willing to spend hours watching a single developing egg, to dissect creature after creature in pursuit of patterns, to organise an overwhelming mass of particular observations into a coherent system. Later, when Aristotle became famous as a teacher of logic and metaphysics and ethics, this habit of patient, systematic observation would remain, in a sense, the hidden engine beneath all of his more abstract philosophical work. He approached questions about the good life, about the nature of tragedy, about the structure of valid argument, with the same careful, categorizing mind he brought to the fish and mollusks of the Lesbian lagoon. It is worth spending a little more time here, resting in this quiet island chapter of the story, because it represents something important about how real intellectual breakthroughs actually happen, which is to say, slowly, patiently, and often far from the centres of power and prestige. Aristotle was, by this point in his life, already a man who had spent 2 decades at the most famous school in the Greek world, and had personal connections to the ruling family of a small but significant territory in Asia Minor. He could easily have positioned himself at the centre of political or academic attention. Instead, he chose the quiet, unglamorous work of wading into shallow lagoon water, opening the shells of mollusks, tracking the reproductive cycles of fish, and comparing the internal structures of dozens upon dozens of different creatures. Consider the specific example of his embryological observations, since it illustrates something essential about his method. To study the development of a chick inside an egg, Aristotle and his collaborators would set aside a batch of fertilized eggs and then open one at a time, at carefully staggered intervals, a few hours apart, then a day apart, then several days apart, recording at each stage what structures had begun to form. In the earliest hours, he noted, almost nothing visible had yet taken shape beyond a small pulsing point, which he identified, correctly, as an early form of the heart, beating before any other organ had become visible. Over the following days, he watched blood vessels extend outward from this central point, watched the emergence of the head and the beginnings of the eyes, watched the gradual formation of wings and feet. This was not guesswork or philosophical speculation about how development in general might proceed. This was direct, repeated, careful observation, the same egg-opening process performed again and again to confirm that what he had seen at each stage was a consistent pattern rather than an accident of one particular specimen. This same patient method extended to his study of marine creatures throughout the Pyrrha lagoon. He distinguished between animals that gave birth to live young and those that laid eggs, and within the egg-laying animals he further distinguished between those whose eggs were fully formed at laying, and those, like certain sharks and rays, whose eggs developed partly inside the mother's body before being expelled in a more advanced state, an observation of what modern biologists would later call a viviparity, a genuinely sophisticated distinction that would not be improved upon in any serious way for well over 1,000 years. He studied the peculiar reproductive habits of the octopus and the cuttlefish, animals whose behavior fascinated him enough that he devoted considerable attention to describing precisely how they used their arms, how they changed color, and how they defended themselves against predators. Later naturalists, working many centuries afterward with the benefit of proper microscopes and established scientific institutions, would confirm the essential accuracy of a striking number of these observations, findings that seemed almost too precise to have been achieved through unaided eyesight and patient dissection alone. It is easy, looking back across more than 2,000 years, to focus only on the moments in Aristotle's biological writing where he made an error, where he claimed, for instance, that the octopus had only 8 arms yet somehow miscounted certain other details of cephalopod anatomy, or where cultural assumptions of his era led him to conclusions about the relative nobility of certain organs, favouring the heart as the seat of intelligence and treating the brain as a mere organ for cooling the blood, a claim modern readers instinctively wince at, knowing what we now understand about the nervous system. But we should resist the temptation to judge this work only by the standard of what came later. Consider instead what it meant to attempt this kind of systematic biological survey, with essentially no prior tradition of comparable scope to draw upon, no microscope, no established vocabulary of anatomical terms beyond what he himself was inventing as he went, and no community of fellow researchers checking and correcting his work across multiple institutions the way modern science operates today. That he got as much right as he did, that his fundamental method of careful, repeated, comparative observation proved sound enough to remain the basic approach of biological science for the following 2 millennia, is itself the genuinely remarkable achievement, far outweighing the specific errors that inevitably crept in. These years on Lesbos, quiet and productive as they were, would soon be interrupted by an invitation that would place Aristotle at the very centre of one of the most consequential political stories in human history. In the year 343 or 342 BCE, a summons arrived from the north. King Philip II of Macedon, who had spent years expanding his kingdom's power and influence over the fractious Greek city-states to the south, wanted a tutor for his son, a 13-year-old boy named Alexander. Given Aristotle's family connections to the Macedonian court, his father having served as physician to Philip's own grandfather, and given Aristotle's now well-established reputation as one of the finest minds to have emerged from Plato's academy, he was a natural choice. Aristotle accepted, and he travelled to Macedon to take up residence at a place called Myesa, where Philip had set aside a sanctuary, complete with covered walkways and gardens, sometimes called the Nymphaeon, specifically for the education of his son and a small group of the prince's noble companions. For several years, Aristotle taught the young Alexander subjects ranging across the whole breadth of Greek learning. Literature, particularly the works of Homer, whose Iliad would remain one of Alexander's lifelong obsessions, he reportedly kept an annotated copy under his pillow even during his military campaigns. Philosophy and ethics, the principles of good government, medicine, given Aristotle's own family background, and very likely some elements of the biological and scientific interests that Aristotle himself had been pursuing on Lesbos. We should be careful here not to overstate what we can know for certain. The ancient sources describing this tutorship are somewhat sparse, and much of what later writers, and much later popular imagination, have constructed around this relationship. Dramatic scenes of the great philosopher shaping the mind of the future conqueror of the known world is more legend than documented fact. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Aristotle did tutor Alexander for a period of several years, roughly from when Alexander was 13 until around 16, when Philip began entrusting the boy with military and political responsibilities of his own, effectively ending the formal tutorship. We can also say that the relationship between the two men, teacher and student, endured in some form well beyond this period, with evidence of ongoing correspondence and, at least for a time, mutual respect. It would be a pleasant, tidy story if we could say that Aristotle's teachings shaped Alexander into the sort of philosopher-king that Plato himself had once written about in his famous dialogue, The Republic. The historical reality is considerably more complicated. Alexander would go on to conquer the Persian Empire, march his armies as far as India, found cities across 3 continents, and die at the age of 32, having built one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen through years of relentless warfare. Whatever Aristotle taught him about ethics, about moderation, about the ideal relationship between a Greek city-state and its neighbours, whom Aristotle, like most Greeks of his time, tended to view with a certain condescension as barbarians, Alexander's actual life as a conqueror does not read like a simple demonstration of his tutor's philosophy in action. Some later sources suggest that Aristotle advised Alexander to treat Greeks as friends, and non-Greeks as one might treat plants or animals, a piece of advice, if accurately reported, that reflects the limitations and prejudices of Aristotle's own historical moment, rather than some perfected wisdom. What is clear is that Aristotle's family connection to this period would eventually turn tragic. Aristotle's own great-nephew Callisthenes, the young historian whom Aristotle had helped raise and educate, accompanied Alexander on his later campaigns into Asia as an official chronicler of the conquest. But Callisthenes eventually fell out of favour with Alexander, reportedly for refusing to participate in a Persian custom of ritual prostration before the king that Alexander had begun to demand even of his Macedonian and Greek followers, a practice many Greeks found offensive to their sense of freedom and equality among citizens. Callisthenes was implicated, rightly or wrongly, in a conspiracy against Alexander's life, and he was executed, imprisoned and killed sometime around 327 BCE. This event placed a genuine strain on the relationship between Aristotle and his former royal pupil, a strain that some ancient sources suggest never fully healed, and that may have contributed to the political vulnerability Aristotle would face in Athens years later, after Alexander's own death removed whatever protection the old teacher-student bond had still provided him. By the time Philip died in 336 BCE, assassinated at his own daughter's wedding celebration, and the 20-year-old Alexander ascended to the Macedonian throne, Aristotle's formal role as royal tutor had long since ended. Aristotle had, by this point, spent several more years in Macedon and its territories, but with Alexander now consumed by the enormous project of consolidating his father's kingdom and beginning what would become his legendary conquest of Persia, Aristotle's own path turned again, this time back toward the city where his intellectual life had first taken shape, Athens. In 335 BCE, at the age of nearly 50, Aristotle returned to Athens. He was no longer the 17-year-old boy who'd arrived decades earlier to sit at the feet of Plato. He was, by this point, one of the most accomplished and widely travelled scholars in the Greek world, a man who had studied at the finest school of his era, conducted groundbreaking biological research on Lesbos, and tutored the young man who was, even then, beginning to reshape the map of the known world through military conquest. And now, rather than returning to the academy, the school of his own youth, Aristotle chose instead to found something new. He established his own school at a place just outside the city walls of Athens, in a public gymnasium area sacred to the god Apollo Lyceus, from which the school took its name, the Lyceum. Unlike the academy, which Aristotle could not lead, having been passed over for its leadership after Plato's death, and having no legal standing as an Athenian citizen to own property within the city in any case, the Lyceum was built on land that, as a metic, a resident foreigner, Aristotle likely could not formally purchase either, though the arrangements around the school's physical space remain somewhat unclear in the surviving sources. What is clear is that the Lyceum quickly became a thriving centre of learning, rivaling and in some respects surpassing the older academy in the breadth and depth of subjects it addressed. The school gained a nickname that has followed Aristotle and his followers down through the centuries, the Peripatetics, meaning those who walk about, a name most likely derived from the covered walkway, the Peripatos, that ran through the Lyceum's grounds, along which Aristotle would walk with his students as they discussed philosophy, logic, natural science, and ethics. There is something worth lingering on in this image. Not a lecturer standing rigidly at a podium, not students seated in silent rows, but a community of thinkers moving together through a garden, talking as they walked, the rhythm of footsteps mixing with the rhythm of argument and counter-argument. It suggests an approach to teaching that valued conversation and shared inquiry as much as formal instruction, a habit perhaps carried over from his own years of walking and talking through the academy decades before. It was during this second Athenian period, spanning roughly 12 years from 335 to 323 BCE, that Aristotle produced the overwhelming majority of the written works for which he remains famous today. This is a crucial point to understand, because it helps explain the peculiar character of most of Aristotle's surviving writings. Unlike Plato, whose dialogues were carefully composed literary works, written in polished prose meant for a wide audience, most of what survives of Aristotle's writing appears to be something closer to lecture notes, treatises intended for use within the Lyceum itself, dense, compressed, sometimes repetitive, occasionally contradictory in small details, clearly meant as working documents for teaching and ongoing inquiry, rather than as finished literary compositions for the general public. We know from ancient sources that Aristotle did also write more polished dialogue-style works intended for wider circulation, much closer in style to Plato's own writings, and that these more accessible works were widely admired in antiquity, praised for their eloquence by later Roman writers such as Cicero. But tragically, almost none of these more polished works survive to us today. What we have instead, what forms the entire body of Aristotle that students and scholars study now, are the working treatises of the Lyceum, the physics, the metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics, named perhaps for his son Nicomachus, or possibly his father of the same name, the politics, the poetics, and the great logical works later grouped together under the title organon, meaning instrument or tool, since Aristotle viewed logic not as a subject in its own right, but as the essential tool for conducting inquiry into every other subject. The scope of what Aristotle attempted during these Lyceum years is genuinely difficult to convey without simply listing the range of subjects he addressed, because the range itself is the point. He wrote about the fundamental building blocks of logical reasoning, developing the system of syllogisms, formal patterns of valid argument that would remain the foundation of Western logical study for over 2,000 years, not seriously challenged or expanded upon in its basic structure, until the development of modern symbolic logic in the 19th century. He wrote about physics, attempting to explain motion, change, causation, and the fundamental nature of matter, developing a theory of four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final, meant to explain why anything happens or exists the way it does. He wrote about metaphysics, the nature of being itself, wrestling with questions about substance, potentiality, and actuality that remain central to philosophical debate even today. He wrote about ethics, arguing that the good life for a human being consists not in pleasure alone, nor in wealth or honour, but in a life of virtuous activity guided by reason, achieving a state he called eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing, through the cultivation of virtues that typically represent a mean between two extremes: courage as the mean between recklessness and cowardice, generosity as the mean between wastefulness and stinginess. He wrote about politics, analysing and comparing the constitutions of dozens of Greek city-states in an effort to understand which forms of government best promoted human flourishing. He wrote about literature and drama in his Poetics, developing an analysis of tragedy that identified elements like plot, character, and catharsis, the purging or cleansing of emotion through pity and fear that literary critics and playwrights would still be discussing and applying more than 2,000 years later. And running beneath all of this, he continued the biological work begun on Lesbos, cataloguing, dissecting and classifying the natural world with the same patient thoroughness he brought to logic and ethics. To organize the collection of this immense range of material, Aristotle and his students at the Lyceum are believed to have assembled what may have been one of the largest libraries of the ancient Greek world, gathering manuscripts, maps, and specimens that supported this astonishing range of inquiry. Later tradition credits Aristotle with essentially founding the practice of systematic library organization, gathering texts not simply to possess them, but to actively use them as the raw material for comparative analysis, much as he had gathered and compared hundreds of animal specimens on Lesbos years before. It is worth remembering, as we imagine this decade or so of extraordinary productivity, that Aristotle was not working in isolation. The Lyceum was a genuine community, populated by other significant thinkers who would go on to make their own contributions to Greek intellectual life. Theophrastus, his old companion from the years on Lesbos, would eventually succeed Aristotle as head of the school, and would himself become known as the father of botany, extending Aristotle's biological methods to the plant kingdom. Other students would go on to make contributions in mathematics, in the study of music, in history, and in medicine. The Lyceum, in other words, functioned much as the Academy once had, as a genuine intellectual community, generating not just the ideas of one great mind, but a whole ecosystem of scholarship that would influence the following generations of Greek and eventually Roman thought. Let us dwell a little longer on the sheer strangeness of what Aristotle attempted to do during these years, because it can be easy, hearing a long list of subjects, to lose the sense of just how audacious this project truly was. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of nearly the entire body of Greek learning up to that point. The poetry of Homer, the tragedies of the great Athenian playwrights, the mathematics developed by earlier thinkers, the political histories of dozens of city-states, the medical traditions descending from Hippocrates, the earlier philosophical systems proposed by thinkers going back more than a century, arguing variously that the fundamental substance of the world was water or fire or an indefinite boundless something, or numbers themselves or unchanging eternal forms as Plato had argued. Aristotle looked at this entire sprawling inheritance and set himself the task of organizing it, testing it, correcting it where he found it wanting, and building something more systematic and more thoroughly grounded in careful observation than anything that had come before. Take his approach to physics as one example of this method in action. Where earlier thinkers had often proposed grand, sweeping claims about the fundamental nature of reality, with relatively little attention to explaining ordinary everyday phenomena, Aristotle insisted on beginning with the world as we actually experience it. The fact that a stone falls when dropped, that fire rises, that a plant grows toward the light, and building outward from these ordinary observations toward more general principles. He developed a theory of motion built around the idea that everything in the world has a natural place it tends toward. Earth and water tending downward, fire and air tending upward, and that understanding any particular motion required understanding the nature of the thing in motion, not merely applying some universal mathematical formula divorced from the specific character of what was moving. We know today, of course, that this particular physical theory was substantially mistaken, corrected many centuries later by thinkers such as Galileo and Newton, who showed that a single set of mathematical laws could describe the motion of both falling stones and orbiting planets without needing to appeal to different natural places for different kinds of substances. But the method Aristotle used to reach his conclusions, careful attention to observed phenomena combined with rigorous logical argument about causes, remained essentially the method that later scientists would use to correct him, which is itself a kind of quiet vindication of his approach, even where his specific conclusions fell short. Consider, too, the sheer practical labour involved in his political writings. Aristotle and his students at the Lyceum are believed to have gathered and analysed the constitutions of 158 different Greek city-states, comparing their laws, their systems of government, their histories of political change and instability, in an effort to understand, empirically rather than merely through abstract theorising, what specific institutional arrangements tended to produce stable, just governments, and which tended to produce tyranny, civil unrest, or collapse. Only one of these constitutional studies, the Constitution of the Athenians, survives to us today in anything like complete form, rediscovered remarkably on a papyrus scroll in Egypt in the late 19th century, nearly 2,200 years after it was written, a discovery that itself reads like something from an adventure story, a lost fragment of Aristotle's monumental research project resurfacing from beneath the sands of Egypt to be read again by modern scholars. But even this single surviving example gives us some sense of the scale of empirical, comparative political research Aristotle and his colleagues undertook, a project without real precedent in the ancient world, treating the study of government not as a matter of abstract philosophical speculation alone, but as an empirical science requiring the patient gathering and comparison of actual historical and institutional evidence, much as he had gathered and compared hundreds of species of animals years before on Lesbos. His treatise on rhetoric, another significant work produced during these years, took a similarly careful, analytical approach to a subject that many earlier Greek thinkers, including Plato himself, had treated with considerable suspicion, viewing the art of persuasive speaking as little more than a tool for manipulation, divorced from any concern for truth. Aristotle took a more measured view, arguing that rhetoric, properly understood and properly practiced, was a legitimate and valuable art, a counterpart to logical argument, useful precisely because human audiences do not always respond to pure abstract logic alone, but can be legitimately and honestly persuaded through a careful combination of logical argument, credible character, and appropriate emotional appeal. He analysed, with characteristic thoroughness, the different types of persuasive speech, the different audiences a speaker might address, and the specific techniques that tended to prove effective, producing a work that would go on to influence the training of orators, lawyers, and public speakers for the following 2,000 years, and that remains, even now, assigned reading in university courses on rhetoric and communication. This period of relative stability and extraordinary intellectual productivity would not, however, last forever. The political world beyond the walls of the Lyceum was shifting in ways that would, eventually, bring Aristotle's second and final period in Athens to an abrupt and unhappy close. Before we follow Aristotle toward the end of his story, let us pause the forward march of years and consider, instead, who this man actually was in the texture of his daily life. What did his days look like? What did he look like? What kind of presence did he bring into a room or onto that covered walkway where he taught? The ancient biographical sources, admittedly written sometimes generations after Aristotle's death, and not always reliable in their details, offer us a handful of physical descriptions. He's described as having been of somewhat slight build, with small eyes, and a notable habit of speaking with something of a lisp or a slight impediment in his speech, though later admirers were quick to insist this did nothing to diminish the force and clarity of his arguments. He's also described as having dressed carefully, even somewhat fashionably for a philosopher, favouring rings on his fingers and taking care with his hair, in a manner that some later, more austere philosophical traditions found worth commenting on, as though it were slightly at odds with the popular image of the philosopher as someone indifferent to worldly appearance. Whether these details are entirely reliable or partly the product of later biographers filling gaps with plausible-sounding characterization, we cannot say with certainty. But taken together, they paint a picture of a man who was not an ascetic, not someone who renounced the comforts and dignities of ordinary life in pursuit of pure thought, but rather someone who seems to have believed, consistent with his own ethical philosophy, that a well-lived life involved a reasonable, moderate engagement with the world's pleasures and comforts, not their rejection. His daily routine at the Lyceum likely followed a rhythm shaped by the very structure of the school itself. Ancient sources suggest that Aristotle divided his teaching, delivering more advanced, technical lectures to his closer, more dedicated students in the mornings, walking with them along the peripatos as they work through difficult logical and philosophical problems, and offering more accessible general lectures to a broader audience in the afternoons or evenings, open to anyone in Athens who wished to attend and expand their education. This division suggests a teacher conscious of different audiences and different levels of preparation, someone who did not simply deliver the same dense material to everyone regardless of their background, but who thought carefully about how to communicate difficult ideas to different kinds of listeners. We know that Aristotle valued organization and method almost as a matter of personal temperament, not merely as an abstract philosophical principle. This shows up again and again in the structure of his surviving works, which typically begin by carefully defining terms, reviewing what earlier thinkers had said on a subject, identifying where those earlier views fell short, and only then building toward his own conclusions through careful, step-by-step argument. This was, in a sense, simply how his mind worked. Whether he was cataloguing 500 species of animals, or working through the ethical question of what makes an action courageous rather than merely reckless. His personal life during these Lyceum years was marked by both continued family devotion and eventually by loss and renewal. His first wife, Pythias, the woman he'd married during his years in Assos, died at some point during this Athenian period, though the precise date is not recorded with certainty in our sources. Aristotle later entered into a relationship, whether formalized as marriage or as a long-term domestic partnership, the sources leave somewhat ambiguous, with a woman named Herpilis, who was likely from his home region near Stagira. Herpilis bore Aristotle a son, whom he named Nicomachus, after his own father, and it is this son for whom Aristotle's great ethical treatise, the Nicomachean Ethics, is often thought to have been named, though as mentioned earlier, some scholars believe the work honours Aristotle's father rather than his son, and the question remains genuinely unresolved among historians. What we can say is that in his will, written near the very end of his life, Aristotle showed clear and specific care for Herpilis, instructing that she be given a comfortable choice of residence, either in his father's old house in Stagira or in a house in Chalcis, along with servants and financial provision, a level of practical, tender concern that again complicates any picture of Aristotle as a purely cold and detached intellectual. Aristotle also maintained what appears to have been a genuine sense of humour and warmth with his students and colleagues, if certain surviving anecdotes, however loosely they should be trusted, are any indication. He is remembered as valuing friendship enormously as both a personal good and a philosophical subject, devoting substantial sections of the Nicomachean Ethics to analysing different kinds of friendship, distinguishing between friendships based merely on usefulness, friendships based on pleasure and the rarest and most valuable kind, friendships based on a mutual recognition and appreciation of each other's good character, a friendship that could only exist, he argued, between people who were themselves striving to live virtuously. It is difficult to read these sections of his ethical writing without sensing that he was drawing, at least in part, on his own experience of friendship, perhaps thinking of men like Theophrastus, his companion since the Lesbos years, or Hermias, whose death he had mourned so openly decades before. There is one more dimension of Aristotle's daily life worth pausing on here, and that is his relationship to physical health and the body. Given his father's profession as a physician, and given his own extensive biological research, it would be natural to assume Aristotle held sophisticated views on health and the human body, and indeed he did, though the sources suggest his own physical constitution was not especially robust. Some later biographical traditions describe him as having suffered from digestive troubles or general physical delicacy throughout parts of his life, requiring some attentiveness to diet and rest, though we should treat these details with appropriate caution, since ancient biographers sometimes attributed physical ailments to famous figures somewhat freely, in keeping with broader patterns of what a philosopher's life was supposed to look like. What is more certain, from the writings themselves, is that Aristotle took seriously the connection between physical well-being and the capacity for a flourishing intellectual and ethical life, arguing in his ethical works that external goods, including a reasonable degree of health and material comfort, while not sufficient on their own for a good life, were nonetheless a real and necessary support for the kind of sustained virtuous activity that constituted genuine human flourishing. He was not, in other words, a philosopher who believed the mind could simply triumph over every bodily limitation through willpower alone. He believed, with the same careful, moderate realism that characterized nearly all of his thinking, that a good life required a reasonable harmony between mind and body, between the internal cultivation of virtue and the external circumstances that made such cultivation possible. It is worth pausing a little longer here, in this quieter chapter of the story, to consider more closely what Aristotle actually believed made a life worth living, since this question sat at the very centre of his thought, and, quite possibly, at the centre of how he tried to live his own days. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he begins by asking a deceptively simple question: what is the highest good for a human being? The thing that everyone, in one way or another, is ultimately aiming at in all their various pursuits. He considers and sets aside several common answers. Pleasure alone cannot be the answer, he argues, because a life devoted only to bodily pleasure is a life more fitting for animals than for a being capable of reason. Wealth cannot be the answer either, because wealth is always sought for the sake of something else, never as an end in itself. No one wants money simply to look at it, but rather for what it can provide. Honour too falls short, because honour depends more on the opinion of others than on any quality residing within the person being honoured, and a truly good life, Aristotle believed, should not depend so heavily on factors outside a person's own control. Instead, Aristotle arrives at a concept the Greeks called eudaimonia, a word that resists any single perfect translation into English, but is often rendered as happiness, or perhaps more accurately, flourishing or living well. For Aristotle, eudaimonia was not a fleeting emotional state, not a feeling of pleasure that comes and goes, but rather a kind of activity, specifically activity of the soul, in accordance with virtue, sustained across a complete life. This is a crucial and often misunderstood point. Aristotle did not believe you could call a life happy or flourishing based on a single good day, or even a single good year. He believed flourishing was something that could only be judged looking back across an entire life, the way a single swallow does not make a summer, as he memorably put it. so too a single good deed or a single pleasant experience does not make a flourishing life. What mattered was the steady, consistent practice of virtue over time, the patient cultivation of good habits until acting well became, in a sense, second nature. This is where his famous doctrine of the mean enters the picture, an idea that has remained genuinely useful to people thinking about character and conduct for well over 2,000 years since he first articulated it. Aristotle observed that most virtues could be understood as a kind of balance point between two opposing vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage, for instance, sits as a mean between the vice of cowardice, having too little confidence in the face of danger, and the vice of recklessness, having too much, a foolish disregard for genuine danger that gets mistaken for bravery. Generosity sits as a mean between stinginess and wastefulness. Even a virtue like proper pride, or what we might today call healthy self-respect, sits as a mean between vain arrogance on one side and a kind of excessive self-defeating humility on the other. It is worth noting that Aristotle did not mean this doctrine of the mean as some simple mathematical formula, always splitting the exact middle distance between two extremes regardless of circumstance. He was careful to note that the appropriate mean depends heavily on the specific situation, the specific person, and the specific circumstances involved. The amount of anger appropriate to one situation might be entirely inappropriate in another, and part of what it means to possess genuine practical wisdom, a quality he called phronesis, is precisely this capacity to judge, case by case, what the appropriate mean actually looks like in a given moment. It is tempting, and probably not unreasonable, to see something of this philosophy reflected in the man's own recorded habits and choices. Here was someone who, by most accounts, dressed with reasonable care but not ostentation, who maintained close friendships without apparent excess or neglect, who provided generously for his household and dependents without extravagance, who pursued the most demanding intellectual work available in his era, while still, it seems, maintaining space in his life for domestic warmth and friendship. We should be careful, of course, not to overstate this connection. We do not have detailed enough evidence to know with certainty how thoroughly Aristotle's own daily conduct matched the philosophical ideals he articulated in his writing, and it would be a mistake to assume that every philosopher perfectly embodies the virtues they describe. But the coherence between the philosophy and what we do know of the life is, at the very least, suggestive, and it offers a helpful lens through which to understand a man who might otherwise seem, from a great historical distance, to be little more than a name attached to an overwhelming body of abstract writing. This, then, was the texture of Aristotle's days during the years of the Lyceum's flourishing. Teaching in the mornings and evenings, walking and talking along the covered paths of the school grounds, tending to a household that included a partner, children, and the memory of a first wife he still honoured, maintaining friendships he clearly valued deeply, and continuing, always, the enormous, patient project of trying to understand and organise the whole of human knowledge. It was, by most measures, a rich and settled life, but it would not remain settled for very much longer. In June of the year 323 BCE, in the city of Babylon, far to the east in what had once been the heart of the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old, and the cause of his death remains debated by historians even today, with theories ranging from illness, possibly malaria or typhoid fever, to poisoning, to complications from the heavy drinking that ancient sources associate with Alexander's final months, though no single explanation commands universal agreement among modern scholars. The death of Alexander sent shockwaves across the entire empire he had built, an empire stretching from Greece through Egypt and Persia to the borders of India, an empire held together not by settled institutions, but largely by Alexander's own personal authority and the loyalty of his generals. Almost immediately that empire began to fracture, as Alexander's generals, the men later historians would call the Diadochi, or successors, began fighting among themselves for control of different pieces of the conquered territory, a series of conflicts that would continue for decades after Alexander's death, and would eventually reshape the entire political map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. For Aristotle, then 61 years old and still teaching at the Lyceum in Athens, the death of his former royal pupil had immediate and dangerous consequences, even though his direct connection to Alexander had grown more distant in the years since the tutorship had ended, and especially since the execution of his great-nephew Callisthenes had strained relations between them. The reason for this danger was straightforward, if we understand the political situation in Athens at the time. Athens, like many Greek city-states, had chafed for years under Macedonian domination, first under Philip and then under Alexander, resenting the loss of the full independence the city had once enjoyed. Aristotle, throughout his long residence in Athens, had always carried the association of Macedon with him. His father's service to the Macedonian royal family, his own years tutoring the Macedonian prince, his personal friendships and connections throughout the region of Macedon and its territories. He was, in the eyes of many Athenians, a man closely tied to the very power that had constrained their city's freedom. As soon as news of Alexander's death reached Athens, and as it became clear that the sudden power vacuum left by his death might offer an opportunity to throw off Macedonian influence, anti-Macedonian sentiment surged through the city. This sentiment did not remain merely a matter of political grumbling. It found a specific target in Aristotle. He was formally charged with impiety, asebeia in Greek, the same legal charge that had been brought against Socrates 3/4 of a century earlier, ultimately leading to that philosopher's execution. The specific accusation against Aristotle centered on that hymn he had written decades earlier in honor of his murdered friend Hermias, the ruler who had been tortured and executed by the Persians. Critics now claimed that this hymn treated Hermias with a kind of religious reverence properly reserved for the gods alone, and used this claim as the legal basis for accusing Aristotle of impiety against the Athenian religious order. It is worth being honest about what was almost certainly happening beneath the surface of this legal charge. Few historians believe that Aristotle's decades-old poem in honor of a dead friend was the true motivation behind this prosecution. It appears rather to have been a convenient legal pretext, seized upon by Aristotle's political enemies in a moment of anti-Macedonian fervour, in order to remove from Athens a prominent figure whose long-standing associations with Macedonian power made him a symbol, fair or not, of everything the resurgent Athenian nationalists wished to reject. Aristotle, according to the ancient sources, made a decision at this point that has been remembered and discussed for over 2,000 years since. Rather than remain in Athens and stand trial, as Socrates had chosen to do so many decades earlier, accepting his fate rather than fleeing the city he loved, Aristotle chose to leave. The words attributed to him, whether historically precise or a later paraphrase that nonetheless captures something true about his likely reasoning, have become one of the most famous lines associated with his name. He is said to have declared that he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy, a clear and deliberate reference to the earlier execution of Socrates, framing his own potential trial and death as a repetition of that earlier injustice, one which he, unlike Socrates, was determined not to allow to happen. We should sit with this decision for a moment, because it reveals something important about how Aristotle understood his own life and his own philosophy. Socrates had famously chosen to remain in Athens and accept his death sentence, arguing, as Plato records in dialogues like the Crito, that a citizen owes a fundamental loyalty and obedience to the laws of the city that raised and protected him, even an unjust application of those laws, and that fleeing would itself constitute a kind of wrong. But Aristotle, we should remember, was never an Athenian citizen. He was, throughout his entire adult life in that city, a metic, a resident foreigner, without full legal standing, without the deep civic bonds that had shaped Socrates' own sense of obligation to Athens. Perhaps this is part of why Aristotle felt no comparable obligation to remain and face what he clearly believed to be an unjust and politically motivated charge. His relationship to the city had always been one of an honoured guest and resident, valued for his learning but never fully belonging in the deepest legal and civic sense, and when that city turned against him, he seems to have felt free to leave it behind rather than sacrifice himself to prove a point about civic loyalty that had never, in truth, been fully extended to him in the first place. It is worth noting, too, that this was not the first time in his life Aristotle had needed to leave a place quickly because of shifting political winds beyond his control. Years earlier, his departure from Assos and the broader region of Asia Minor following the capture and execution of his friend Hermias had been driven by very similar forces: the sudden, violent intrusion of great power politics into a life otherwise devoted to quiet philosophical work. There is a kind of pattern here worth noticing, not because it makes the final departure from Athens any less painful or significant, but because it helps us understand something about the world Aristotle actually inhabited. He lived his entire adult life in the shadow of enormous political forces, the expanding power of Macedon, the fierce independence movements of the Greek city-states, the eventual world-altering conquests of his former student, and the chaotic scramble for power that followed that student's early death. Through all of it, Aristotle had tried to maintain a kind of protected space for careful, patient, apolitical inquiry, a garden where ideas could be tested and refined without regard for which faction currently held power. And yet, again and again, the outside political world found ways to intrude upon that space, reminding him and reminding us that even the most abstract philosophical life is never entirely separate from the material and political conditions that make such a life possible in the first place. And so, in 323 BCE, Aristotle left the city that had shaped nearly the entirety of his intellectual life, the city where he had studied for 2 decades under Plato and where he had spent another 12 years building and running his own school at the Lyceum. He travelled north and east, across the narrow strait separating the Greek mainland from the island of Euboea, to the town of Chalcis, where his mother's family had roots and where he would spend the final year of his life. The details of Aristotle's final months in Chalcis are unfortunately sparse in the surviving historical record. We do not have the kind of rich, detailed account of his final illness and death that Plato's dialogues gave us for the death of Socrates. What we have instead are a handful of scattered facts, later biographical summaries, and the remarkable survival of Aristotle's own last will and testament, which offers us perhaps the most intimate and reliable window we have into his state of mind during these final months of his life. We know that Aristotle's health, which may never have been especially robust, declined during this period. Ancient sources suggest he suffered from what may have been a stomach or digestive ailment, though as with much of the biographical detail surrounding ancient figures, we should hold this with some caution, since precise medical diagnoses from more than 2,000 years ago filtered through later biographical summaries are difficult to verify with confidence. What does seem clear is that within roughly a year of his departure from Athens, in 322 BCE, Aristotle died in Chalcis at approximately 62 years of age. Before his death, however, he took the time to compose a will, and this document, preserved for us through later ancient sources, particularly the biographical compilation of Diogenes Laertius, gives us a remarkably clear and human picture of a man putting his affairs in order with the same careful, methodical thoroughness he had brought to every other aspect of his intellectual life. In this will, Aristotle named an executor, a man named Antipater, who was at that time serving as the Macedonian regent overseeing Greek affairs in the turbulent period following Alexander's death, a choice that reflects Aristotle's continuing, if by then politically dangerous, connections to Macedonian power, even at the very end of his life. He made careful provisions for Herpilis, the woman who had shared his household in his later years and had borne him his son Nicomachus, ensuring she would have comfortable housing, either in his ancestral home in Stagira or in a house in Chalcis, along with servants and financial support, in gratitude, the will notes, for her devoted service to him. He made provisions for his children, for his son Nicomachus and his daughter Pythias, named for her mother, Aristotle's first wife. He specifically requested that his own remains be buried alongside those of Pythias, his first wife, honouring, the will states, her own explicit wishes on the matter, a detail that offers a quiet, tender glimpse of continued devotion to a woman who had died years before. The will also addressed Aristotle's slaves, a detail that requires us to sit honestly with the moral realities of the ancient world Aristotle inhabited, a world in which slavery was a normal, largely unquestioned institution, and one which Aristotle himself in his political writings had attempted to justify philosophically, arguing, in a manner that modern readers rightly find deeply troubling, and that stands as one of the most significant and legitimate criticisms of his thought, that some human beings were naturally suited to be slaves by virtue of their nature, and yet, in the personal, practical details of his own will, Aristotle specified that several of his slaves should be freed upon his death, and that others should not be sold, but should continue to be well cared for, evidence of a man whose personal conduct toward the individuals in his own household showed a degree of practical humanity that sits uneasily alongside the more troubling abstractions of his philosophical writings on the subject. This tension between Aristotle, the careful, humane presence in his own household, and Aristotle, the philosopher who provided intellectual justification for one of history's great moral wrongs, is one that honest students of his life and thought must hold without easy resolution. The will also attended to smaller, more domestic matters, instructions regarding certain statues he had commissioned, likely dedicated to various gods and to the memory of his parents, and provisions ensuring that the household would continue to function smoothly through the transition. Taken as a whole, the document reads not as the final testament of a distant, abstracted philosopher, consumed only by grand ideas, but as the careful planning of a man who cared deeply about the practical well-being of the people who depended on him, who thought of specific individuals by name and made specific provision for their futures even as his own life was ending. We do not know the precise circumstances of Aristotle's final hours, whether he had time to say farewell to those closest to him, whether his mind remained sharp until the very end, or what, if anything, his last words might have been. The historical record simply does not preserve this level of detail for us, unlike the far more famous and dramatically recorded death of Socrates generations earlier. What we know is the fact itself. Sometime in 322 BCE, in that house in Chalcis, within sight of the strange shifting currents of the Euripus Strait, the mind that had attempted, and largely succeeded, in mapping the whole of human knowledge as it then existed, came to its quiet end. He was buried, as he had requested, and though the exact location of his grave has been lost to the passage of more than 2,000 years, his hometown of Stagira, according to some later traditions, eventually honoured him with a monument, and the altar where his ashes may have rested was said to have been a site of local reverence for generations afterward, a quiet gathering place where later travellers might pause to remember the physician's son who had once left this small northern town to study in Athens, and had returned, in memory if not fully in body, as one of the most celebrated minds the Greek world had ever produced. Whatever became of the physical monument, the far more enduring monument to his life was already, at the moment of his death, beginning to take shape in the form of the vast body of written work he left behind, work that would go on to shape human thought for the next 2 millennia and beyond. When Aristotle died, leadership of the Lyceum passed to his old friend and longtime collaborator Theophrastus, the man who had accompanied him decades earlier during those formative years of biological research on the island of Lesbos. Under Theophrastus, the Lyceum continued to flourish for a time, and Theophrastus himself went on to make lasting contributions to the study of botany, applying and extending the careful, systematic methods he had learned from Aristotle to the classification of plants, work that would earn him the title, still used today, of the father of botany. But the fate of Aristotle's own written works, in the centuries immediately following his death, took a strange and precarious turn, one that very nearly resulted in the loss of nearly everything we now possess of his thought. According to accounts preserved by later ancient writers, particularly the geographer and historian Strabo, Aristotle's personal library and manuscripts eventually passed into the hands of a series of individuals who did not fully appreciate their value, and at one point the collection was reportedly hidden away in a cellar or pit for safekeeping, where the manuscripts suffered damage from moisture and neglect over a period of many decades. It was not until roughly 2.5 centuries after Aristotle's death that these surviving manuscripts were rediscovered, purchased, brought to Rome, and eventually edited into something resembling the organized collection of texts that scholars still study today, largely through the efforts of a scholar named Andronicus of Rhodes in the 1st century before our era. We should hold this story too with some caution, since ancient accounts of manuscript transmission are not always perfectly reliable, but the broader point it illustrates remains valid regardless of the precise details. The survival of Aristotle's works down to the present day was not a smooth, guaranteed inheritance, but something closer to a near miss, a body of knowledge that came remarkably close to being lost entirely to the accidents of history. Once these texts were properly edited and began circulating more widely in the ancient world, however, their influence expanded steadily and, eventually, enormously. Roman writers and thinkers engaged seriously with Aristotle's logical and ethical works. As the Western Roman Empire declined and eventually fell, and as much of classical learning became fragmented or lost in Western Europe during the centuries sometimes called the early medieval period, it was scholars in the Islamic world, particularly in centres of learning across the Middle East, North Africa and Spain, who preserved, translated and extensively studied Aristotle's works, producing detailed commentaries that would themselves become enormously influential. Thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Avicenna and Averroes engaged so deeply and productively with Aristotle's philosophy that Aristotle came to be referred to, within this rich tradition of Islamic philosophy, simply as the first teacher, a title reflecting the foundational role his thought played in shaping subsequent philosophical inquiry across the Islamic world for centuries. These scholars did not simply preserve Aristotle's texts passively as a kind of intellectual storage. They actively engaged with his arguments, extended his logical and metaphysical frameworks into new territory, and produced commentaries so thorough and so influential that later European scholars, once these works finally made their way back into Latin translation, often studied Aristotle and his Islamic commentators together as a single, intertwined body of thought. It was largely through this Islamic scholarly tradition, and through translations that moved from Arabic into Latin, often via centres of learning in Spain where Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars worked in proximity to one another, that Aristotle's works were eventually reintroduced to Western Europe during the period we now call the High Middle Ages, roughly the 12th and 13th centuries. This reintroduction had an absolutely transformative effect on European intellectual life. The Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, undertook the enormous project of synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, producing a body of work that would come to dominate Catholic philosophical and theological education for centuries afterward. Aquinas referred to Aristotle simply as the philosopher, using the definite article as though there could be no ambiguity about which philosopher among all others in history he meant, a title that reflects just how thoroughly Aristotle's thought had come to be regarded as the very foundation and standard of rational inquiry itself within medieval European universities. This influence extended far beyond theology and formal philosophy. Aristotle's biological classifications remained the basic framework for the scientific study of living creatures for close to 2,000 years, not substantially revised or superseded until the development of modern taxonomy in the 18th century, and, eventually, the theory of evolution in the 19th century. His system of logic, the syllogism and the broader structure of formal deductive reasoning remain the essential foundation of logical study taught in universities across Europe for centuries, not seriously supplemented by new logical systems until the development of modern symbolic logic in the 19th and 20th centuries. His ethical framework, centered on the cultivation of virtue and the pursuit of human flourishing through reasoned, moderate action, continues to this day to be studied and applied by philosophers working in what is now called virtue ethics, one of the 3 or 4 major traditions of ethical theory still taught in universities around the world. His analysis of tragedy and dramatic structure in the Poetics continues to be referenced, directly or indirectly, in the training of playwrights, screenwriters, and literary critics. His concepts of plot structure, character, and catharsis having become so deeply embedded in how we think about storytelling that many people invoke them without even realizing their ultimate origin traces back to a philosopher writing more than 2,000 years ago. Consider for a moment the strange and remarkable durability of this. Most human knowledge, most scientific and philosophical understanding gets revised, superseded, and eventually replaced as new evidence and new methods of inquiry emerge. This is in fact exactly as it should be, a sign of healthy, ongoing intellectual progress. And indeed, many of Aristotle's specific scientific claims have long since been overturned. His belief that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones due to their nature, his geocentric model of the cosmos with the Earth fixed at the centre of the universe, his theory of spontaneous generation suggesting some simple creatures arose directly from non-living matter rather than through reproduction. All of these specific claims were eventually shown to be mistaken by later scientific inquiry, in some cases not until many centuries after his death. And yet, remarkably, the underlying method he pioneered, the commitment to careful observation, systematic classification, and rigorous logical argument as the proper tools for understanding the natural and human world, proved durable enough that it essentially became the foundation upon which those later correcting discoveries were eventually built. In this sense, Aristotle's greatest and most lasting legacy may not be any single specific claim he made about the world, but rather the disciplined, patient method of inquiry itself, a method so foundational that we now often take it for granted as simply what careful thinking looks like, forgetting that someone, a boy from a small town in northern Greece, had to develop and demonstrate that method for the very first time. There is another dimension of this long afterlife worth sitting with quietly, and that is the way Aristotle's works helped ignite the very beginnings of the scientific revolution in Europe, even though that revolution would eventually mean the overturning of many of his specific conclusions. The universities that emerged across medieval Europe, in Paris, in Oxford, in Bologna, in Padua, organized much of their curriculum around the careful study of Aristotle's texts, particularly his works on logic and natural philosophy. Students spent years working through his arguments, learning to reason according to his principles, learning to observe and classify the natural world using his categories. And it was precisely this rigorous training, this deeply ingrained habit of careful argument and systematic classification, that later gave figures like Galileo Galilei the intellectual tools they needed to eventually challenge and overturn specific Aristotelian claims about physics and astronomy. Galileo, we should remember, was himself trained thoroughly in Aristotelian philosophy before he began his famous experiments with falling objects and his observations of the heavens through a telescope, observations that directly contradicted several of Aristotle's specific astronomical claims. In a strange and fitting way, the very intellectual discipline Aristotle had helped establish, the commitment to careful observation and rigorous argument as the proper foundation for understanding the natural world, became the tool later scientists used to correct him. This is perhaps the deepest compliment history can pay to a thinker. Not that every one of his conclusions proved permanently correct, but that his method proved sound enough to eventually produce its own corrections. Consider, too, the specific case of his work in what we would now call formal logic. For well over 2,000 years, from Aristotle's own lifetime until the middle of the 19th century, when mathematicians and philosophers such as George Boole and Gottlob Frege began developing entirely new systems of symbolic logic, Aristotle's system of syllogistic reasoning remained the essentially unchallenged foundation of formal logical study across the Western world. A syllogism, in its simplest form, involves two premises leading to a necessary conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is the most famous example, though notably not one that appears in exactly this form in Aristotle's own surviving texts, having been constructed by later commentators to illustrate his method in a memorable way. Aristotle identified and catalogued the different valid patterns, or figures, through which such syllogisms could be constructed, and distinguished them carefully from patterns that merely appeared valid, but actually contained hidden logical errors, an achievement so thorough and so carefully reasoned that philosophers working more than 2,000 years later, even after developing entirely new and more powerful systems of symbolic logic, continued to regard Aristotle's original system as a genuinely remarkable achievement, correct as far as it went, simply eventually surpassed in scope by newer tools addressing forms of reasoning Aristotle's original system had not attempted to cover. We might also pause on the way Aristotle's thought continues to surface in fields he could scarcely have imagined. In modern computer science, certain foundational ideas about the classification of objects into categories and hierarchies central to how software engineers organize complex systems, trace a conceptual lineage back to Aristotle's own careful work, classifying living creatures into genus and species, a method of nested categorization that remains recognizable in modern biological taxonomy and that influenced, indirectly but genuinely, later systems of formal classification across many fields of knowledge. In modern psychology and behavioral science, researchers studying what makes people resilient, what habits actually produce lasting well-being rather than fleeting pleasure, and how character and virtue develop over a lifetime through practice and habituation, frequently find themselves returning, whether explicitly or not, to frameworks that echo Aristotle's insistence that flourishing is a matter of sustained activity and cultivated habit, rather than passing emotional states. Even certain strands of modern psychotherapy, particularly approaches that emphasize the cultivation of good habits and the alignment of daily action with one's deeper values, bear a recognizable family resemblance to the ethical framework Aristotle articulated more than 2,000 years ago in the gardens of the Lyceum. We should also take a moment to consider how thoroughly Aristotle's influence has embedded itself into the ordinary vocabulary and habits of thought that we use every single day, often without any awareness of its ancient origin. When we speak of something being a golden mean, a moderate balance between two harmful extremes, we are drawing, whether we know it or not, on Aristotle's ethical theory of virtue. When students in schools around the world learn the basic principles of logical argument, the structure of premises leading to valid conclusions, they are learning a system whose basic architecture Aristotle first laid out more than 2,000 years ago. When biologists today speak of taxonomy, the careful classification of living things into related categories, they are continuing a project Aristotle began in that lagoon on the island of Lesbos, watching fish and mollusks with a patience that has echoed down through every subsequent generation of naturalists. Even the very word we use for the study of existence itself, metaphysics, derives ultimately from the simple, almost accidental fact that, in the ancient collections of Aristotle's works, the treatise addressing the fundamental nature of being was physically placed on the shelf after meta in Greek, his treatise on physics, a small cataloguing decision that has given an entire branch of philosophy its name for over 2,000 years since. Let us return, at the end of this long story, to that image with which we began. An old man in a modest house in Chalcis, looking out, perhaps, at the strange, restless currents of the Euripus Strait, in the final months of a life that had already accomplished more than most human minds manage across many lifetimes combined. We do not know for certain that he looked out at that water and thought about the mysteries of nature he had never fully solved. It is, as I said at the beginning, a lovely story, but not one we can verify. What we can say, with confidence, is this. Here was a man who lost both of his parents while still a child, who was raised by a guardian's careful attention, who travelled as a teenager to the greatest centre of learning in his world, and spent 2 decades absorbing everything it had to offer, and who then, rather than simply repeating what he had learned, spent the rest of his life quietly, patiently, methodically building something new, a way of looking at the world, at animals and plants, at arguments and evidence, at tragedies performed on a stage and constitutions governing cities, at the very question of what makes a human life good, that would prove durable enough to shape human thought for more than 2,000 years after his death. Here was a man who tutored a boy who would go on to conquer most of the known world, and who, whatever the precise nature of that relationship, could not prevent his own great-nephew from being executed by that same former student. a reminder that even the most careful philosophical education cannot fully control where a human life or a human empire will eventually go. Here was a man twice forced to leave the city that had shaped his intellectual life most deeply, once at the death of his teacher, when leadership of the academy passed to another, and once at the end of his own life, fleeing a politically motivated charge rather than repeat what he saw as the injustice done to Socrates. Here was a man who, in the careful provisions of his final will, showed a tenderness and practical devotion to the specific people in his life, a devoted companion, 2 children, a household of servants, some of whom he freed, that complicates and enriches whatever image we might otherwise hold of Aristotle as simply a distant, purely rational thinking machine. And here, above all, was a man who believed, with a conviction that shaped every single treatise he ever wrote, that human beings possess a distinctive capacity for reason, and that the proper use of this capacity, patient, careful, honest inquiry into the true nature of things, represents one of the highest and most fulfilling activities available to us. He called this contemplative life, the life of careful thinking pursued for its own sake, one of the very highest forms of human flourishing available to us, even as he also insisted throughout his ethical writings that such a life of thought must remain grounded in practical virtue, in the ordinary business of living well among other people, treating them with justice, courage, generosity, and genuine friendship. Perhaps this is the thought to carry with you, gently, as you drift toward sleep tonight. A boy born in a small, unremarkable town on the edge of the Greek world, who lost his parents young, who spent 20 years as a devoted student before ever becoming a teacher himself, who watched chicken eggs develop day by day beside a quiet lagoon, who walked and talked with his own students along a covered garden path outside the walls of Athens, and who, in the end, spent his entire life simply trying to look closely and carefully at the world, and to think as clearly and honestly about it as any human mind ever has. He believed that the unexamined pursuit of pleasure alone could never bring lasting happiness, that true flourishing required the patient cultivation of virtue and the honest use of reason. He believed that even the smallest creature, a fish, an insect, a growing seed, deserved to be studied with the same careful attention we might give to the movements of the stars, and he believed, perhaps most gently of all, that a good life was not a matter of dramatic singular achievement, but of steady, consistent, virtuous activity, carried out day after day, year after year, until a life, looked at as a whole, could finally be called good. Aristotle died in that house in Chalcis in 322 BCE, but in every university lecture hall where students still learn to construct a valid argument, in every biology classroom where students learn to classify living things into careful categories, in every discussion of what makes a tragedy moving or a friendship true or a government just, something of that quiet, patient, endlessly curious mind continues, even now, to walk beside us. There is one final image worth holding on to before we close. Somewhere in the Nicomachean Ethics, in the midst of all his careful arguments about virtue and the mean and the proper structure of a flourishing life, Aristotle pauses to consider friendship, and he writes, in effect, that no one would choose to live without friends even if they possessed every other good the world could offer. It is a small, quiet admission from a man whose surviving works can otherwise seem so relentlessly systematic, so devoted to categories and definitions and careful logical distinctions. And yet here, tucked into the middle of his most personal philosophical work, is a simple acknowledgement that a good life, however rationally examined, however virtuously conducted, is ultimately a life shared with other people. We see this conviction reflected everywhere in the actual details of his biography that have survived to us. in his devotion to Hermias, honoured even after death with a poem, in his careful raising of his sister's grandson, in the tender provisions of his final will for Herpyllis and his children, in his lifelong companionship with Theophrastus, beginning on a quiet island and ending only with Aristotle's own death, after which Theophrastus carried the work of the Lyceum forward into a new generation. Perhaps this, more than any single doctrine or discovery, is worth carrying with you as you drift towards sleep. A mind capable of cataloguing 500 species of animals, capable of laying the foundations of formal logic still taught in universities today, capable of writing systematically about nearly every field of human inquiry then known, still understood, in the end, that none of it would have meant very much without the people who shared his life alongside it. Somewhere between the vast, patient labour of understanding the whole of the natural and human world and the small, ordinary tenderness of providing carefully for the people he loved, Aristotle seems to have found something like the flourishing he spent his whole life trying to define. Thank you for spending this time with the story of his life. If it brought you some measure of calm, consider returning for the story of another remarkable life next time you need a quiet voice to carry you towards sleep. For now, let the strait outside that old window settle into stillness, let the currents finally rest, and let your own thoughts, like his, come gently, gently to their close. Rest now. Sleep well.